Zephyr's Pass is an indie adventure game that released in August of 2024 for the Game Boy Color and was published under Incubate Games. The excellent trailer made by the developer piqued my interest, and after two playthroughs, one of them being 100% completion, I'm ready to give my take on this ambitious title. Zephyr's Pass's story is very reminiscent of the original Star Wars, and the setting definitely has a sprinkling of Dune. A young boy longs for adventure outside of his sheltered lifestyle and is thrust into the world and into adventure when an outsider crash lands where he lives. This outsider happens to be a woman, and in typical hero fashion, our protagonist Abel seeks to rescue her from the clutches of a purely evil villain. Abel soon realizes that the stakes are higher than he originally thought, as this evil threatens everyone on his homeworld and not just the damsel in distress. Abel teams up with an airship pirate crew to find the pieces of the armor of Zephyr, which are scattered across the land and have a chance to stop the bad guy. Zephyr's Pass's story is told through dialogue, flashbacks, and interactive sequences, and at a very snappy pace. The game will often teleport you to the next point of interest in the story to save you the time of traveling there, which players on a tight schedule will appreciate, though it feels like certain sections of the story are too brief, with little time to reflect on what's happening, or for the player to build a sense of suspense. Despite you taking on the typical role of the Chosen One, Zephyr's Pass's story does surprise and entertain, and it's a joy to read and watch unfold. The gameplay loop is straightforward and easy to understand. You'll explore the desert overworld in your airship to find the next settlement where a Zephyr armor piece resides. You'll then help the residents there with something, which will range from talking to its inhabitants and completing some simple chores, all the way up to completing a mini dungeon type quest to gain their trust in order to have a chance to obtain one of these Zephyr armor pieces. After that, you'll have access to the settlement's dungeon proper, where you'll clear rooms of enemies and complete puzzles very much in the style of a 2D Zelda game. Once you've collected all four pieces of the mythical armor, the region of the overworld where Thane waits as a final boss will become accessible. The puzzles you'll complete, while simplistic, function well, and by the final two dungeons offer a mild to moderate challenge. The combat, on the other hand, doesn't reach the same heights. Unlike even Zelda 1 from the mid-1980s, Abel's swordplay cannot be described as satisfying. Aside from enemies briefly flashing red, there is little indication of you landing your strikes, and when the enemy dies, there's a 1 or 2 frame animation of the enemy disappearing out of existence. Enemies do not receive knockback, and neither do you. Combat effectively worsens when your sword is upgraded to fire projectiles, because instead of holding the sword button to charge and fire the projectile as the game intends, simply mashing the sword button will cause the same effect, forcing you to carefully swing your sword at a slower rate in order to avoid accidentally charging when you don't mean to. The Zephyr armor abilities add some variety to gameplay, but mostly act as a way to access new areas. The boots, for example, allow you to move slightly faster and jump over select gaps. The only ability that's really optional in its utility is the shield, but it's also easily the most overpowered item in your arsenal. Holding A to activate your shield literally prevents any damage befalling you, and remembering to equip it before entering certain boss fights, since pausing and equipping cannot be done once the boss fight starts, basically trivializes the battle. The visuals and audio are top notch. This is honestly one of the best art styles I've seen on the Game Boy Color. The different regions you explore have very distinct landscapes, and specifically the materials used to build these worlds make the absolute most out of what 8-bit can do. The world has a very organic and lived-in vibe. Where most 8-bit games look pixelated and very simplistic, Zephyr's Pass exceeds the limitations of the hardware by beautifully blending detailed materials that blur the line between 8 and 16-bit. Sandstone looks gritty and imperfect, and metal surfaces appear rusted and weathered. The music is occasionally memorable, and in general it serves the gameplay very well. Each song seems to have been carefully curated to invoke a certain mood or theme where it takes place in the game. Now we're going to move on to a section I'm going to call Oversights and Bugs. Now normally I wouldn't devote a section to this topic, but unfortunately this was one of the biggest takeaways from my playing of Zephyr's Pass. I already covered the issue with charging up the sword's projectile, but I ran into several more issues during my 2 playthroughs of the game. Enemies you encounter will sometimes present motionless, like their AI is broken, songs will occasionally fail to end at the correct transition, and I found myself soft-locked on 2 occasions while trying to enter doorways. I also found that there were times when the programming simply didn't consider the player experimenting around in the most basic ways. For example, at this part of the game, you speak to this young man who then disguises himself as a sheep and walks off the screen to the south, at which point you're expected to follow him. But if you simply go north to the previous screen after speaking to him and then return, he will respawn in his original location, and from there you can continue south to see him in his sheep costume getting kidnapped. The chest plate is a Zephyr armor piece you get in the second half of the game, and it allows you to swim in either water or lava, and the game seems to make a point of equipping it for you for your first interaction with swimming. But there's this cutscene sequence sometime later, which ends with you standing on an island surrounded by lava after presumably swimming there, and your natural instinct after gaining control will be to walk towards the lava, at which point you'll be given a message telling you to put on your chest plate, despite there being no way for you to have gotten there without wearing it. There's another instance similar to this at the very beginning of the game. When you first gain access to the desert overworld, you can stumble upon this optional area with a body of water, and the game will notify you that you need the chest plate to swim, despite this happening well before knowing of the chest plate's existence. For a game this saturated with detail and hard work, it's surprising to see moments like this. The game is also pretty confused about when to allow the player to use his Zephyr abilities and sword. Like here, where I was randomly allowed to swing my sword near these guards that I'm trying to keep the peace with. Here, I'm unable to raise my shield in this specific boss fight for some reason. There are several more examples of little oversights and glitches happening throughout my playthroughs, but by far the lowest point of the game has to be the second phase of the final battle. I won't show it here because spoilers, but basically the fight consists of extremely forgiving quick-time button presses where you always have to block 3 times before being given 1 chance to attack, and it drags on for far too long with no challenge, and the animations of the fight specifically for your main character appear unfinished. Simply tightening up these button input timings and randomizing whether you will block or attack would go a long way to make this fight more enjoyable. Now, although I am touting the game's presentation and story far above its gameplay and technical qualities, it would be an insult to label this as a tech demo or an art delivery system. Zephyr's Pass is a true video game and worth playing through for its 4 to 5 hours, but I can't help but feel that the game would have benefited greatly from more playtesting to bring it up to a more finished product experience. For the $14 digital download, I feel like I got my money's worth. But I would be quite disappointed if I had paid the full physical release price tag of $60. Zephyr's Pass is a great example of why you need playtesters and in general multiple eyes on your game during development. I hope that Zephyr's Pass's developer continues to work on this game and releases an improved version of it in the future because I think it is truly a worthwhile story and gameplay experience for the Game Boy Color.